Everybody. This is an interesting format we've got this time. So we're doing a combined Zoom and in-person format. So this is the first time we've been in person since, I think, March of 2020. And I'm in Seattle right now, so I live there now, but I will be still hosting meetings over here. And so let's get into what we've got this month for announcements. So many of you guys have already done this, but if you could renew your memberships, that would be great. You can either send a check by mail, or we have PayPal on the website, which I think is the easiest way to renew your memberships. We need volunteers for all committees on the board and people who would like to be involved in the board. So if you'd like to get involved in the Vancouver Audubon Society, or you know someone who would be interested in getting involved in the Vancouver Audubon Society, just email me at president@vancouveraudubon.org and I will direct you to the correct channels. In terms of volunteering, especially micro volunteering, where it's not as big of a commitment as being on a board, we need volunteers to help with the spotting scopes at Birdfest. So Birdfest is going to be October 1st. Okay. So if you'd like to volunteer, either email me or talk to one of the board members at the meeting and we'll get you set up. So the other thing that's coming up is Give More 24. That is this large giving event where you can give to a lot of charities of your choice, and we have signed up for that. So that will be on the 22nd of September. So put that in your calendars if you'd like to give to Vancouver Audubon and a lot of other causes that you care about. You can do that on that day. Additionally, we also need volunteers for the show and tell program in October. So these show and tell programs, we used to do them before the pandemic. They were really fun. People would show their pictures, a lot of them from the Vancouver area, but some of them from, around the world. So if you could send at least 3 to 5 photos to meetings@vancouveraudubon.org, and we will put that together as a show and tell program for our October program. Okay, so for field trips, there is one on Thursday, September 15th, to Eagles Pride Golf Course in Nisqually. The leader will be Randy Hill. There are some other field trips as well on our website. However, they don't have specific days because they're kind of dependent on what the weather is going to be like. So just check out our website and see if those might be of interest to you. Okay. So our speaker today is Allison Anholt. She is a community science biologist and a lead for the Snowy Plover program for Portland Audubon, and she will present on snowy plovers.
So thanks for the introduction and thanks so much for having me. I am based full-time for Portland Audubon on the Oregon coast. However, I grew up right here in Camas, so it's a delight to be back in my old stomping grounds and hometown. So thanks so much for having me. I'm the coastal community science biologist for Portland Audubon. This is a new position. Just started as in full-time capacity in March. So I'm relatively new to Portland Audubon. So definitely ask all the questions on the presentation so I can keep refining it for other similar talks. And then also people who contributed to this presentation are Joe Liebezeit, also at Portland Audubon, and Laurel Hillman with Oregon State Parks, which you'll learn more about, is one of our important partners on the program. Some of our other partners on the Snowy Plover monitoring program are down here on the bottom. So first of all, who here has seen the Western Snowy Plover before? Okay, so most people, that's awesome. They're hard to see. They're tiny, they're the color of sand, and they range all throughout the sandy beaches from Washington down to Mexico, northwestern Mexico. And that's the Western Snowy Plover. So Charadrius nivosus nivosus is a scientific name. Don't have to remember that, but basically it means Western Snowy Plover. There are other populations of snowy plovers that are also the same taxonomically. So they're the same species and subspecies, but they're nothing like the Western Snowy Plover. Those are the ones inland in the areas like the Saline Lake, so Eastern Oregon and Washington, the Great Salt Lake, And there's also a population on the Gulf Coast. So genetically, even though they're really similar, these birds never interbreed, they never connect, and they obviously face very different conservation challenges. So you might imagine the coastal beaches here are very different than the Gulf Coast beaches, which are very different from the inland populations of beaches as well. So, you know, they're all very different, even though they're the same genetically. Plover habitat is a really specific and narrow thing. Here's our range map that shows the different plover populations throughout the country in the US here. So you can see they're sort of dispersed across different areas. But plover habitat here in Oregon, so back to in Oregon and Washington, California, back to the western snowy plovers, is a really, really narrow thing. The nesting area in the area where they mostly hang out is above the high tide line to the bottom of the vegetation line of the dunes. So if you can all imagine our beaches, sometimes this is a really narrow area and sometimes it's wider, it just depends. But in general, this is where they live their entire lives, on these sandy beaches. How does one identify a snowy plover? So there's a few ways. One is which they have a very short plover-like bill, and this is because they forage for food above the ground. So they go run after flies mostly, and little sand fleas, the little jumping insects you see in the rack line or the line of debris left by the ocean tide line. And so they have these really short bills because they're visual hunters and they don't probe into the sand and the mud a lot like other sandpipers might. They also have a partial neck collar. So as opposed to a semi-palmated plover is a really similar species, they have a full neck ring around them. If you see a broken neck ring, only a part of a neck collar, it's pretty clear you probably have a snowy plover. They're small, they're between a sparrow and a robin size. They're only about 6 inches, so they're like yay big. They're pretty small. They're often banded is another way to tell a snowy plover. So they often have these color bands you can see here on the bottom of their legs. So this one, we would describe this as orange, white, orange, blue. And these color bands here are on snowy plovers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but because of their conservation status, because they are considered threatened, federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so this is part of the research actions it takes. We can identify this bird as an individual. There's only one orange, white, orange, blue out here on the western coast. And so we know for sure all the history of this bird just by looking at its bands. And this is a thing that won't be out there on semi-palmated plovers, for example, which don't have as high of a conservation status, and they're nesting way up in tundra, Alaska. And so basically, if you see a bird with color bands on it, you've got a snowy plover. They live exclusively, like I said, on ocean beaches, and they particularly like sandy inlets. River inlets are particularly big fans of. And another great way to identify snowy plovers, I like to say they don't like to get their toes wet. They usually are in dry sand or damp sand, but not really in the high tide line. So if you see a kind of sandy colored bird running in and out of the waves, that's not a snowy plover. That's probably a sanderling. But so that's a good way to tell them apart. If you see a bird picking along the vegetation line left by the last high tide, it's a good chance it's a snowy plover. But if you see one running in and out of the super wet sand, it's likely not. I always say likely and usually, because every time you say anything with absolutes in biology, they do the wrong thing. So, but almost always. There's also differences you can tell apart for some months of the year, from about March through now. You can tell apart the snowy plovers by sex. And so the male, it looks different than the female in a couple of different ways. The female is much more plainly marked. This is because she's the one that does most of the incubation during the day. So she has more of a need to be able to be even more blending in even better with the sand. They blend in really incredibly well with the sand no matter what. She blends in even better. She doesn't have the black markings. She doesn't have that black spot behind the eye. The black spot behind the eye, I think, is the single most reliable way to tell snowy plovers apart. The females just never have it. You can see on the right here, it's kind of that color of the rest of her feathers. And then they have a thicker neck collar that's blacker. So if there's lots of black markings on the head, that's a male versus a female as well. So this plover timeline, we'll go through and show this with pictures, but really briefly, the breeding season starts in mid-March and ends in about August, except for this year, we had a really bad spring, and our plover breeding season will end September 10th when the last of our chicks fledge out on the beaches. That's extraordinarily late. Usually it's until about August. Throughout that time, they lay nests multiple times. They repeat the process until they succeed. So their nests often fail due to a number of factors we'll talk about. And then the females can double brood. So even if she has a successful nest, her nest will hatch, the male will take care of the chicks, and then she'll go and go lay another nest. And so this process repeats itself up to 5 or 6 times. until about August, when they literally see the angle of the sun in the sky and are like, it's too late, we're not doing it anymore, and then they give up for the season. Hopefully by that point they've had a successful nest, but they are a species that has a lot of challenges out there. So these are the general, and then the non-breeding season. Some of them will go south. So some of them will do the classic neotropical migrant thing where they'll go south to Baja Sur in Mexico, or Baja Peninsula in California, or Southern California. But most of them just hang out right where they are. They go and they will often group together. They'll do plover explorations and wander around in August, September. And we see those banded birds all throughout Oregon and Washington. And they just explore different areas, maybe potentially to scout breeding habitat for next year. I don't know. We haven't done that research yet. And then in the wintertime, they kind of aggregate together in bigger, looser groups, mostly at river inlets. Those are their favorite areas for a number of reasons we'll talk about in a bit. But let's show you this as well. So the first thing they do is they begin egg laying. So this is their first egg right here in the center of the screen. This tiny little thing, they're about this big. So they're really small. They blend in. The best way to find them is to follow tracks right up to the nest. So here are these snowy plover tracks. They're kind of like the wheels of spokes of a wheel pattern. So they walk up to it from all different angles. Plovers in the breeding season almost never fly. You usually don't see them flying because they're depending on the cryptic coloration, which is a lot more obvious when they're walking, when they're flying than when they're walking along the sand. So they, even though they can fly, they almost never would, with the exception of like maybe if a peregrine falcon came in really fast, they'd take off really quickly. Other than that, they just won't fly. Yeah.
So apparently you're cutting out online.
Okay. I'll lean in closer. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So they finished laying about 3 days later. So it takes them about 3 days to lay a full clutch of eggs, which is 3 eggs usually. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 4, but almost always it's 3. And it takes them a day and a half between each egg to lay. So once they reach full clutch, then they incubate for 35 days. The female incubates during the daytime, the male incubates at nighttime. 35 days is a long time, so they have to share incubation. This is common with birds that lay eggs for a really long time. But the trade-off is that when they hatch, they're what's called precocial. So the chicks can get up and walk around really, really quickly. So the delaying incubation in between eggs 1 and 3, that day and a half in between, they don't really incubate unless they absolutely have to. Unless it's super windy or super cold, they won't incubate them, and that's so they hatch mostly synchronously, so they hatch together. You don't want to have to depend on a nest hatching and try to run around following chicks. So they hatch almost synchronously together overnight. The chicks start running around within a couple hours. Does everyone see all 3 chicks in this image? So they're tiny, they run fast, and dad is doing all of the parental care at this point because mom is off laying another nest usually. So dad is in charge of all chick rearing. It's kind of his trade-off for her laying those eggs and doing the majority of the incubation because the daytime is a lot longer in the summertime and in the late spring. So his trade-off is that he gets to do all the chick rearing. So it's done exclusively by the male. He protects them. He lets them not out of his, like rarely out of his sight. Sometimes they wander far, and when you're watching them, you're like, oh no, what are you doing? But usually they're really, really close to dad. He'll teach them how to hunt. This is a chick trying to catch one of those sand fleas. It's super adorable. They're very cute. They get called cotton balls on toothpicks. And they look like this for about 28 days before they reach fledging age. And fledging means that they're able to free fly on their own. And then we'll get to the fledge next. But by August and September is when most of the chicks are fledged, and the adults start changing too. So this adult is molting. You can tell it's got patchy bits of white on its back instead of that overall sand color. It's looking pretty rough, right? The feathers are looking really like they need some help. And that's because this bird is molting. And they're also starting losing that breeding plumage. So this one is, you can't even sex them at this point. It's hard to tell which one this is, if it's a male or female. I think it's probably a male because it has this dark eyebrow. It's still got that neck color, but this patch behind the eye kind of has patches of black in it. So the adults start to molt and wander, and they start becoming really hard to tell apart, male or female, and they start forming loose groups. And the chicks also fledge and wander. This one is a fledgling. It has a really speckled head, has no eyebrow to speak of, no eye patch, and a really, really pale neck collar. and it has scalloping around its feathers. So there's white at the edges of their feathers, their back feathers, and brown in the middle. And they sort of look fresh and big-eyed because they gain that feathering around their eye last. And so they start to wander around too. They're looking around in August and September for where to nest next year. Oftentimes they'll go back to the exact same spot of beach where they were born, but that's not always the case. And you know, that's part of the reason why we started this program, is because the south coast of Oregon has had so many plovers that they finally started to re-inhabit their nesting grounds in the north coast of Oregon. And that's because of these fledglings wandering, and they don't have enough available habitat for all the birds there. It's a happy problem to have for plover conservationists. And so the chicks, when they're fledging, they wander around and they try to find a nesting spot for next year. And so it's super interesting to watch where they go. There are a few major threats to plovers. Like I said, in the inland population in the Great Salt Lake, you might imagine that one of their threats is the lack of water there, which might affect what prey they're able to eat. It might affect what predators can get to their nests and things like that. On the Gulf Coast, super busy beaches, lots of people, that becomes a bigger issue. Here in our coasts in Oregon and Washington, the biggest issues they face are kind of a mix of all three of those. So disturbance by people. Here on the left-hand image, you can see this nest is right next to a tire track. So driving on beaches can directly trample and drive over nests. Same with people. People can directly walk on top of nests, not even realizing they're there. Imagine not knowing what plover was, not being a birder, and just not even noticing that there's 3 eggs this small. Because the plover's defense is to leave the nest. They're unlike killdeer, which they're related to. Killdeer's name is Charadrius vociferus, and they're vociferous in their voice. And so killdeer are much more obvious near their nests than snowy plovers are. Snowy plovers will just get up and walk away. And so you often don't see the plovers near their nests. So disturbance is a really important factor affecting plovers. Predators are a really important factor as well. So northern harriers have made a comeback, and they're a major conservation threat to snowy plovers. They also have conservation challenges as well. So that becomes a challenge of how to manage for both of those two things. Their other predators are things like crows and ravens, coyotes are all big ones. Those are predators that are obviously native to Oregon and Washington, but on the beaches in artificially high numbers because of the things that we've done to build up the beaches, basically putting in campgrounds, lots of trash cans, homes, all the things that are really great for crows and ravens. We've cut roadways in. And so there's a lot more of those native predators on the beaches than there used to be. However, the single greatest threat to plovers in our area in the Pacific Northwest is habitat reduction. And that's not just because of things like beach development or the number of people out there who want to do different activities. That kind of falls under the disturbance category. It's mostly because of this grass called European beach grass. It's this grass that we see on dunes here in the center. It's really thick. It creates those dunes where it's like, you know, a really good workout to walk over the dunes to get onto the beaches. It's that grass. Back in the day, before this grass was introduced intentionally in the 1950s, because their roots go down almost 100 feet. So they're crazy beach grasses compared to our native ones. And so that helps to accrete sand, to collect sand in and to build up dunes. This is obviously a wonderful thing for things like flood reduction. You know, Oregon and Washington both introduced this plant in order to build up dunes to provide a natural way to reduce flooding to people's homes. But it worked way too well. And where that happened, it meant that there is no longer any plovers. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the grass is way too thick. Plovers really prefer river inlets because it naturally knocks back a lot of that dune vegetation and it becomes a nice open area, and they can see predators from 360 degrees. They depend entirely on both their camouflage as well as being able to see. And so when you build up the grass like this, they can't see a coyote from a foot away, much less 1,000 feet away, which is how long they need for them to get off their nest. And in addition, they can't walk their chicks down these trails unless we've cut out dune trails. So because they walk all the time, and because their chicks obviously can't fly for 28 days, they have to walk them down to the tide line in order to forage. And so when you build these massive cliffy dunes like we have now, it completely eliminates plover habitat. So it did a really great job of doing what it was supposed to do, which is provide flood protection, but everywhere where these dunes were built was a loss of plover habitat. And that's why they largely condense at the river inlets, because the power of the winter storms overtakes the power of this European beach grass. But on the major front beaches, this is a really big problem. Because of these factors, there's a population crash for snowy plovers, down to about only 50 individuals in 1990 in the state of Oregon. By 2003, they're still only recorded on 7 sites in Oregon and all along the more isolated southern coast. It was at this point, and so this is range-wide, so the western snowy plovers, Oregon, Washington, California population, range-wide decline of about 65%. So because of this, plovers were listed as threatened under the Oregon's Endangered Species Act in 1975. They were listed as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act in 1993. And a federal recovery plan was created in 2007. Tells you a little bit about how long it takes to get things done. But there's a recovery plan which set and outlined goals, which ultimately would take plovers off of the endangered species list. As we might have heard recently, that bald eagles were taken off the endangered species list, right? Because they met their recovery plan goals. And the same thing happens with any bird that's listed as threatened or endangered, any animal, is they have a population figure that when they grow to that, theoretically, they can get taken off the endangered species list. So recovery plans outline goals for population recovery. They also give more money, resources, and set specific management actions within Oregon and throughout their range, and thresholds for that delisting. And they also formalize laws governing plover management. So there's a couple different management actions that were taken. One of which, and again, this is focused on Oregon, but I'll talk about Washington a little bit as well. So one of which was the creation of snowy plover management areas in Oregon. These are areas that establish a higher level of protection for snowy plovers within these areas. So some of them, most of them, are in areas where plovers already like. So they went out and they said, okay, these are good river inlets with a long sandy spit with none of that or very little of that European beach grass. You know, they have a wide open place to be. There's lots of prey. We're going to establish this area as a snowy plover management area. There's 16 areas throughout Oregon, which covers 49 total miles of coastline. And the ones on the north coast are primarily managed by Oregon State Parks and Recreation. All of the snowy plover management areas have additional recreation restrictions within and outside of the snowy plover management area. So for example, you can only walk in the wet sand, because anywhere in the dry sand, you know, a plover might be laying their eggs. And so that means that people can stay only below the mean high tide line. They can't bring their dogs, they can't fly kites, they can't have drones. They can have horses, because horses aren't perceived as a predator by plovers, and because they walk so slow. So they can't have dogs, but they can have horses. There's no driving. And this is in effect every year from March 15th to September 15th. And in addition, in these areas, there's more intensive monitoring and protection of plovers on snowy plover management areas. So there's a lot of habitat restoration projects that have been going on. So basically bulldozing some of the dunes in areas where there are not a lot of houses behind there. And so they're bulldozing the dunes down to mimic a more natural habitat for plovers. Down in the south coast of Oregon, they've been doing active predator management actions. So actively killing targeted predators out on these areas as well. In addition, it's things like putting on those bands, those snowy plover bands, having monitors go out and try to follow every single nest. And again, this is all basically started happening on the south coast of Oregon. And then snowy plovers in Washington, I don't work with them, so not focusing as much, but just so you know, they're only in Pacific and Grays Harbor counties. And if you think about how Washington looks, that makes sense. They like these sandy open beaches. And so kind of the area north of Ocean Shores is really the furthest north area. They're managed by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. The recovery goals are combined with Oregon. So it's kind of this Oregon and Washington are one unit. And so they have that pair threshold. Washington also had its own statewide recovery goal that they briefly obtained in 2015, but now they're pretty much dependent on immigration from Oregon birds and from that, mostly that South Coast population as well. The protection areas and recreation restrictions exist. So people have gone out to areas like Westport, Long Beach Peninsula, kind of Ledbetter Point State Park, and things like that. They also have really similar to snowy plover management area recreation restrictions and protection areas for the snowy plover nests that are symbolically posted, spring and post fencing, that prevent people from going in there, or at least discourage people from going in there. So the good news is that all of this action that was thrown at snowy plovers has worked, and their population has really gone way up, as you can see here on this chart on the left. from 1990 up until, this is a little bit outdated of a chart, but yeah, up until now, the population has continued to grow. There's some variability year to year. This is really common with plover. Sometimes they have good years, sometimes they have bad. That's due to a number of things, like just how bad the predator, what the predators are doing out there. If there's really bad weather this year, like I said, it's a super late year because April and May, as we all know from being around here, were really, really rainy and extra windy, and it really paused nesting. These things happen every year. Snowy plovers live for about 10 to 15 years old. And so they have many years in which to grow their population by biologically replacing themselves. That means they need to have 2 chicks that make it to adult age and breed it themselves. They need to replace themselves, and they need to add 1 more in order for that population to grow. And they have 10 or 15 years to do it. So they fail a lot, and that's what happens. And some years are better than others, but overall the population is growing if you look at it from a long time. So because this population and recovery actions have worked so well, plovers, really excitingly, in 2018 have started re-inhabiting their traditional nesting sites on the North Coast. Like I said before that, most of the plover population is restricted to U.S. Forest Service lands, like down in the Oregon Dunes National Wildlife or National Recreation Area. And so because their population has grown so much substantially, plovers have been like, okay, there's too little space down here, there's too many birds, let's go seek out some other alternative habitat in the North Coast of Oregon. So in that regard, basically, since the early 2000s, these 5 snowy plover management areas in the North Coast have been established for plovers, but plovers haven't shown up until 2018. So with that, our program was begun once they started showing up. And these areas are Clatsop Spit in the very north, so that's right on the Columbia River jetty area, Nehalem Spit down at Nehalem Bay State Park, Bay Ocean Spit, which is a Tillamook County State Park site right outside of Tillamook, Neathart Spit, which is part of Cape Lookout State Park, and South Sand Lake Spit, which is Sitka State Recreation Area. There are monitoring goals for this program, the Plover Patrol Program. At each snowy plover management area, we want to find and document, again, these are the 5 sites in our North Coast area. We want to find and document each plover on the site at least once a week. So we want to go out and do surveys at least once per week at each of these sites, and to look for snowy plovers out on the area. We want to count how many we find. We want to see if they're male or female. We want to see if we can record any of those bands, and we want to find every single nest that we can out there. And have I mentioned yet that this is all done by volunteers? This is a volunteer monitored program. I'm the sole staff member in charge of everything related to this program. And so this is done by volunteers, which is really extraordinary. It's one of the only programs like it in the country, which is really exciting. And this is hard. So we want to monitor each nest, ideally, once we find nests, we want to monitor them ideally at least 2 times until they hatch. And we want to monitor each chick until they fledge. So those 2 different goals we keep in mind. It was how many nests do we have, how many nests hatch, and how many of those nests fledge. And we want to do all this without harming the birds or causing undue disturbance. We don't want our presence in there to affect them in any way. So that's a really, really important factor in what we do. And monitoring snowy plovers is really, really hard. So can anyone identify how many snowy plovers are in this picture? Anyone want to take a stab at it? 4? Want to say 4? Okay. So there's actually, so there's 1 in the back that's not circled. So that's a good catch. Thank you. I'll have to fix this in my presentation. There's 1 right there. And then there's 2 right here. And then this one, and this is where it gets tricky, is not a snowy plover. This is a semi-palmated plover. And they sometimes hang out together. Their tracks look identical. They hang out in similar habitats. And so we have to differentiate between them all the time, which is not that easy. This view is pretty realistic for what we see. Again, they see us before we see them, and they really take off running slowly or walking away. So basically you're looking for sand that's moving. You have to defocus your eyes and look for moving sand. And sand that's sand colored, not mud colored, like the semi-palmated plover. So you can see the difference here. It's just slightly browner, that's all. So it can be really tricky. Can we see the nest in this photo? Kind of hard, right? So there's a nest right here, if you zoom it in. So this is really how tricky it is to find nests. It almost always looks like the left image, and you don't get up until you see it really closely like that. We're often will follow tracks to the nest, but sometimes if the wind blows, which it does every day, If the wind blows, it covers over those tracks pretty quickly, which again is how cryptic and how well they blend in. So this is part of their evolutionary strategy that worked super well for so many years until we came along and planted European beach grass and brought in predators and drove bikes on the beach and all those other things. So it is a really great evolutionary strategy for a long time. And you can see why. They blend in super, super well. There's also can be really challenging because of all of the factors that you deal with on beaches. So here, these two dogs are right next to these two plovers. This is a baby chick right here on the bottom part of the screen, running away from the dog action. And then up here is a dad, the dad who's really upset. And so he's flying, so you know he's upset, right? Because they almost never fly. But these dogs are right behind him and his chick. I actually, just to throw it out there, these two chicks fledged. There's another chick that's not pictured here. They fledged this year at Seaside. So it's on Seaside Beach, Oregon. It's not a snowy plover management area. It turns out snowy plovers don't listen to signs. And so there's no additional recreation restrictions. There's nothing we could do about these dogs. And they somehow, they laid a nest there. We actually had 3 nests there this year. One of them, we put up symbolic string and post fencing around the individual nests, but we didn't add all that recreation restrictions because that's part of the recovery plan. Legally, we have to follow those rules. And so we put up string and post fencing, like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And they ended up hatching. And then I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And now as of August 31st, they fledged. So it's really exciting. Very big deal. And so they made it and they dodged these dogs, and dad was a very good dad. So again, we want to do all this without harming the birds or adding our own disturbance on them. So that requires legal permits in order to monitor an endangered species. So we are all of the volunteers are on a federal endangered species incidental take permit is what it's called. And so it basically says we're allowed to be in the snowy plover management area, and we're there even though we're causing disturbance. We are causing these birds to get off their nests in order to put a GPS point on them and in order to monitor them, but we're doing it for a reason. And so we're on a special permit that allows us to do this. And that requires coordination and approval of each volunteer, monitored with Oregon Parks and Recreation, as well as with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which manages the Endangered Species Act. It obviously requires intensive volunteer training. We want to make sure that people know how to find these birds, but also know how to do it safely without stepping on nests or chicks. And it requires constant in-season communication. We have to, we have these text message chains where I'll be like, nest 3A is good, 3 eggs. Somebody's like, oh, nest 3A, okay, that one hatched yesterday. So we each have to follow this whole list of all of the nests and what happens to each of them and communicate constantly within the season. So volunteers go through a 3-hour at the beginning of the season, virtual, like classroom style training. Next year, we're going to probably do it in person, maybe, we'll see. And then they also go out and do an initial field training with me. From there, they're placed into a track, depending on what they'd like to do. Once they've been able to get out and see this, the snowy plovers on the ground, they can either become nest monitors or wet sand volunteers. So wet sand volunteers are people who maybe aren't local, or maybe just don't want to, or intimidated by the data collection, or just don't want the responsibility of having to walk through the nesting areas and to take notes on a smartphone and do all that other stuff. However, they're still really useful because they're walking in the wet sand, so they're not adding undue, extra disturbance to these birds, and they're counting every bird they see and every band that they see. So this is the first year we've done this, and we've discovered so many cool things. I'm still working through the data because the season hasn't actually ended yet. I'm still working through all the data, but people have found birds from Oregon, Washington, California. They've seen birds move from one site to the other. They've counted all kinds of really awesome things just by virtue of being out on the beaches a lot. The nest monitors are people who are able to commit to going out in the site at least once every couple of weeks in order to monitor those nests, and they have to submit a higher level of data collection, and they're placed on the federal endangered species permit. So nest monitors are paired with experienced volunteers for the first season, because you can go out there and train them in March to find nests, and once chicks hatch, it's a whole new ballgame. It's a whole different training that they need to do. So they're placed with a monitor or with mentors for the first season. We use data collection, web-based, and collect all the monitoring data in the field for 2 hours. So this is kind of what one of our nest sites look like. All the red is failed. So you can see how there's a lot of failed nests in this area. This yellow one ended up hatching, and we had another one that hatched as well. And we have to submit data on the same day, so somebody can go out the next time and have the up-to-date status. And so it looks almost like a social media feed. So it shows all of your nests, where they are, what bands the parents have, and things like that. and what their current status is. It's pretty cool. And they have to communicate that with all their other on-site volunteers. So volunteers will volunteer at one of the snowy plover management areas, or sometimes two if they're really into it. Our monitoring results have been pretty awesome since this program started. So since 2018, we've conducted 646 surveys at 6 North Coast sites. And so again, that's the snowy plover management areas plus a couple of those ones that decided to nest in just weird places. What's really exciting is we've monitored 124 nests, and the program has grown each year. So in the first year, we found 4 nests, and then in 2019, we found 20. We found 21 in 2020, which is we weren't able to get out on the beaches in 2020 like we have been in other years because Oregon State Parks shut down a lot of their beaches for a big part of the plover nesting season because of COVID. So this data is not really reflective of the growth. So we've been able to do more surveys. So we had 35 nests in 2021 and 44 in 2022, and that's with even the big gap in nesting that we had this year in in April and May, which is normally their busiest time for nesting. So the program has grown quite a bit. With the addition of these wet sand volunteers, we've conducted 320, so of our 646 surveys, 322 were this year. So our program has really grown quite a lot in effort. And what's really great also is that we've also been able to conduct hundreds of outreach interactions. So that's maybe talking to people who are like, oh, what are you taking photos of with your camera or spotting scopes? And we, are able to show them plovers. We're able to talk to people about why they shouldn't bring dogs on the beaches because dogs look like plover natural predators like coyotes or foxes. So we're able to communicate that with people. So we're able to just be the eyes and ears on the ground, what's going on the beaches and some of the hazards that plovers face. We collect data when we're out there on predators that we see. So if we see harriers or peregrine falcons or crows or ravens or coyotes, we see tracks. We record information on that as well. And we also collect information on disturbances. So all of those different beach violations, as well as how many people are using the beach. The state park beach rangers, not only are we on a text message basis with them, but they also can see that same social media app that we have, our data collection app, and they can see exactly when and where the hazards are for these sites, just in real time. So that's a really great thing for them to be able to be like, oh, shoot, there's lots of problems on Saturdays. Perhaps I should put more effort to going out here on Saturdays to try to stop people from breaking these rules and affecting the plover habitat. So that's what our data contributes to. Just a couple of cool monitoring results. So this bird here, this is a banded bird. It's hard to see because its bands are very faded. This is white line, white black is its name. So white line, white black was on Nehalem State Park for 3 different nests. And so they stuck around. We recorded them on every single survey between April and August. So that's pretty exciting. And then finally their nest hatched last year. Meanwhile, this is aqua red violet, which is another male. And so it was recorded at the end of March in Nehalem State Park. It nested in April at Nehalem State Park, and we didn't record it after about May 21st. So it hung around for 2 months. And then it went all the way down to Yachats at the end of June. And so at the end of June, it went about 99 miles away, that is, and it began to hatch on, so it laid a nest immediately, and it hatched on July 23rd. And with that, 1 chick and 2 eggs were recorded. So it was just starting to hatch. And then they went out there the next morning to see if the other 2 chicks hatched. And they reported that there was a new fire pit dug about 35 feet from the hatching nest. And there's no chicks seen. And the dad was really upset and they were never seen again. So these stories are good and bad, but honestly, we couldn't get them without the level of volunteer effort and things we're able to see out on these beaches. And, so ideally from something like this, the beach rangers in charge of Yachats would be like, okay, now we know when the nests are hatching. We're going to go out and make sure that people don't build beach fires around there. They'll do extra patrols, for example. So this just helps to focus and target efforts. We also get to see beach changes in real time. So this is a difference in one of our sites. This is Sitka Sedge State Natural Area. You can just see here on Google Maps how much this has changed from year to year. This is one inlet. This is what a winter storm does. So in 2017, there's very little sand on the north end, which is important because the north end is not a protected snowy plover management area. It's owned by the Forest Service, and it's a really popular ATVing site. It's called Sand Lake. Really popular with recreationists, with ATVers. There's a campground right here. There's a big dumpster right here, which attracts crows and ravens and raccoons and all these other things. and Sitka Sedge lost all of its sand and it all went over to Sand Lake. So Sitka Sedge, a protected area, had no more plover habitat, and Sand Lake had all the plover habitat. So 2021 was a really bad year at that site. This year, fortunately, the inlet reshifted itself and Sand Lake lost a bunch of sand again. It went back to Sitka, and we also did a habitat restoration project of bulldozing down these dunes and have seen more plovers in that area as well. So fortunately, it's kind of reversed itself, but with the reduction of vegetation, you can see all the sand on these inlets here. So there's none of those tall dunes. And so they really prefer this area. And so we just want to have it where they have extra protection, ideally. So the advantages of this unique volunteer model, like I said, I've been looking around to try to see how many other plover monitoring volunteer models there are out in the country, and there really aren't that many. So both with snowy plovers as well as piping plovers, which are kind of the east and coast equivalents of our snowy plovers, there's a lot of monitoring that goes on with both of these birds. They all are listed either federally threatened or endangered. And so there's every single nest needs to be found and monitored. And volunteers just do not do that work in most places. So there are some advantages to having this volunteer model, this unique model we have here in Oregon. Volunteers are often local, so they're usually living right next to those beaches, and they care deeply about them and what happens on those beaches. Those who make it through the intensive training, we have about a 50% dropout rate between like the online and the field, and then another 50% between the field and people signing up to do more surveys, which is expected. And so those who make it through the training are deeply passionate about it as well. So not only care about their local beaches, but also care about the plovers. It allows far more coverage than people like a single me can't make it to all these sites every single day, and yet volunteers can. So it allows far more coverage for less budget output, less money basically from the state parks. And what I think is most important is that they act as beach ambassadors. These are members of their communities, and people usually know that they're involved with plovers. And so, for example, we had one volunteer who sits on the city council. I had no idea. And at one of the council meetings, they're like, hey, we need more signs about dogs coming in from this beach pathway. And he's like, yeah, we definitely do, because there's plovers here, and here's why. And they ended up getting budget funding to put more signs up. So there's people affect very real change when they are local members of the community. So the future of the program, we just got extra funding to keep this program going and to expand it quite a lot. And so when we do that, we want to continue improving data quality and consistency and making sure that it fits all the needs of the managers like Oregon State Parks. We want to expand research on the North Coast snowy plover. So figure out what hazards they're facing that might be different than what they face down in the South Coast of Oregon, which they put all that initial monitoring and research money into, and we're able to grow that population. We want to do the same thing on the North Coast. We also want to focus more on outreach opportunities and education. So we want to be able to communicate with the local community members, get out to schools, get people involved in their snowy plovers that are right here in their backyard. And we want to create more tracks and opportunities for volunteers. I don't like seeing a dropout rate of people who don't want to go out on the beaches. So maybe something like being able to be beach stewards, where they communicate with people coming onto the beaches about the importance of snowy plovers and protecting the habitat and those recreation restrictions. Maybe it's people who like to go be educators in the local schools. We've been putting cameras on some of the nests in order to understand what predators are coming in the nighttime when we're not out there monitoring. So people might be able to sit at home and be able to do that as well. So just creating more opportunities for volunteers to get involved in non-traditional ways we haven't figured out yet. And then also to more efficiently connect this data with management decisions. So we want our data to be useful. We don't want to be out there disturbing the plovers unnecessarily. And we really like it to go into management actions that can help the plovers on the North Coast as well. Okay. Does anyone either virtually or here have any questions? And then before I say that, if you have any questions, or maybe if you wanted to get out and get out on the Oregon coast and see some of these plovers yourself, just feel free to email me. I'm happy to get you out there. And if you want to follow our work, just go to audubonportland.org, and it's under our community science section. Yeah, go ahead.
So you're tracking them with GPS from the nest?
Not yet with GPS.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. Not yet with GPS. However, very excitingly, the Forest Service down in the South Coast just got a research permit to do GPS backpack tracking, and to be able to do that hopefully next year. So one of the biologists there went and trained with biologists in Mexico. It's limited by tech. Plovers are small, and the GPS monitors have just become small enough to be able to use them effectively on plovers. So This,
I'm talking about the nest.
oh yeah, sorry, we do, this is like little GPS devices on the birds themselves, but yes, we do GPS track every single nest. So we take a GPS point.
How accurate?
They're accurate within about 9 feet or so. So yeah, it's not bad. It depends on a lot of things like the weather that day and things like that. But generally speaking, GPS is available about 9 feet. So we also write down and take pictures. We're like, it's by the curvy piece of wood, you know, so that often helps as well. Yeah.
When you go in to bulldoze the dunes,
Mhm.
discussion, what time of year do you do that?
Winter time to not affect plover. So outside of the plover season, which is March 15th through September 15th. So they go in the dead of winter to do that. Good question.
People question what is going on?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes. And those projects are new. There's only 2 that have been done on the North Coast, dune restoration projects. So we try to communicate that to people who are at the parks and things like that as well. And we do them in areas where they're not directly in front of people's homes and things like that too. Yeah.
Oh, actually, I have one thing to add. Could you repeat the question that people are asking in the
Oh, sure.
audience so everybody
Of course.
could hear it? Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
The first question was about how we GPS monitor the nest. And the second question was how do we do the dune projects? When do we do them? The habitat restoration projects, and do people care when we do that or ask about it?
So when the dad's taking care of the first chicks that we potentially mom's on eggs again, double duty and kind of incubate at night again.
Oh, good question. So she goes with a different mate. Yeah, so the question was, yeah, thank you. He just told me that. So the question was, when the male is chick rearing and the female goes to lay another nest, does he then do double duty and incubate at night while also trying to manage those chicks? And the answer is that it's a different male. So so the male for the first successful nest, they're like, great, because it takes a long time for them to succeed. There's often a few nest failures before there's a successful one in each season. And so the males are kind of just waiting around for something to happen. So she'll find another male who's waiting around. Yeah.
Is that haystack rock?
This is, so the question is in this photo, is this Haystack Rock? This is the southern Haystack Rocks. This is Cape Kiwanda in Pacific City. This picture is taken from Sitka Sedge. So it looks a lot like Haystack Rock, and it's actually called Haystack Rock / Cape Kiwanda. Yeah.
I want to see snowy plovers in, I know you said that they're going to be breeding up until September, and they would be around in October and November to decide them.
Yeah, so a good, where would be a good place to find snowy plovers in October, November? And that's a great question. In Oregon, we haven't done a ton of that research on the North Coast, and I don't know yet whether or not they all travel down to the South Coast. I do know that at places like Newport, for one Christmas bird count that I went to down there a couple of years ago, I saw like 75 plovers in one spot, which is a huge number. Really cool. And so they group together in larger groups around like the inlets that they prefer, I guess. And I don't know what the preference is based on. This is some future research we need to do. In terms of the North Coast in Oregon as well as in Washington, I don't know those winter areas. I hear reports that there's quite a few seen at Sitka Sedge State Natural Area, that there's quite a few seen at Bay Ocean. I know they hang around at Nehalem Bay State Park. So a lot of the same areas where they breed, because they still prefer those river inlets just in larger groups. But I don't know how long they do that for. I'm brand new to this. So this will be my first winter on the coast, and I'll find out. So yeah, not sure. But I would imagine river inlets. Yeah, good question. The question was, is there any breeding going on inside bays? No, and that kind of surprised me because piping plovers, where I did about 10 years working with piping plovers out east, and my master's thesis is with them too. And they're much more flexible with their habitat areas than snowy plovers are. Snowy plovers are very rigidly on those river inlets or on the ocean front beaches. Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes you can see them occasionally on inside of Newport Bay, but they wouldn't nest there, as far as I know. Yeah, nice. Yeah, they'll fly to forage in good areas, but they probably went back. Newport is a tough spot because there are snowy plovers that like Newport, but it's not any snowy plover management area, so they don't have additional recreation restrictions, even though they love like South Beach State Park For example, there's always several plovers that try there every year, but there's no additional recreation restrictions on them because it's not a designated snowy plover management area. So it's difficult. Yeah.
Do they have only on saltwater beaches or will they do freshwater?
The question was, do they nest only on saltwater beaches or also in freshwater? And it's all for the western snowy plovers, the Oregon, Washington, California range part of the population, it's all saltwater beaches. And then that's completely flipped on the sort of inland snowy plover areas. Well, I guess they're in hypersaline lakes like the Great Salt Lake and those hypersaline lakes, but they're also in some freshwater lakes in the interior parts of the population too.
Does it matter what time of the day? What's the best time of the day if you want to see?
Yes, good question. The question was, what's the best time of day to see snowy plovers? The morning is always best, but really it's tidally dependent. So the best time to see them is at a high falling tide. And the reason for that is because the tide has just come up and it's deposited lots of debris and vegetation on a rack line. And so there's lots of fresh prey items for them to get. And also the beach isn't so wide for the low tide that they're not dispersed across this huge area. They're kind of condensed up to that rack line. So that's the best time to find them, is at a high falling tide. If it's super windy out, they like to kind of crouch down and hide out of the wind, and they don't move around as much. So if you have a calm morning with a high falling tide, that's your best chance of seeing plovers. They're very picky that way. Anyone else?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's pretty amazing, and it's great to see that there's this recovery happening. So I was just wondering about, obviously, you're partnering with Oregon State Parks and Fish and Wildlife. Are they able to educate like people coming to the state parks, like maybe talking to people that come there? Like my husband's out in Anholt, we actually
Nice.
Good.
Good.
As we were talking about, like, running, all over the place there.
Yeah.
How do they manage?
Yeah. The question is, do Oregon State Parks, Fish and Wildlife, are they able to teach people or educate them about plovers before they even get out kind of on the beaches? And the answer is, we try. So at Anholt State Park, for example, anyone who's camping is supposed to get a fact sheet about snowy plovers and what the restrictions are in the recreation areas. There's also things like on the dune crossovers from parking lots on the trails, they'll put posts out literally in the middle that you have to navigate around in order to, and on there they say no dogs, snowy plover area to the left or something like that. We partner with them and do as much education as we can. So one of the things I do is take out all the campground hosts for each one every year on a plover survey who want to go. And so because they're talking to 10 times more people than even our volunteers are. So if they get these simple talking points and messaging and get involved with it, it's a really effective way to reach more people. So I've started taking out the campground hosts for the sites. And Oregon State Parks does have a website where it has all that information on there. And there's other ways. So like for drone users, for example, they have a warning on like where they're able to fly and things like that. So there's lots of different targeted messaging. The signage is the one that's tricky because the tide takes away every sign that you try to put up. So you have to put the signs up high enough where the tide won't wash it away immediately. But then at a low tide, it means that it's so far away that people don't even see them. So the signs just at the snowy plover management area are a constant challenge, and plovers don't listen to signage. And so they'll nest outside the signs. It becomes a whole thing. So we spend a lot of our time in this program. Nicely, we don't enforce rules. We have no enforcement ability, but we talk to people as nicely as we can about the rules and restrictions, and the state park rangers do as well. And they have enforcement abilities too. So we do call them if things get out of hand as well. So there's, they definitely do some education, and so do we on those lands as well. Yeah. Okay, anyone in the Zoom space have any questions? No? Okay. Sorry about the audio quality on it.
One person. They've seen them.
Nice.
Anholt and City Pacific.
Great. So that's a further point of confirmation that they're at Anholt and Sitka in fall and winter time as well. If you go on eBird, I've also like cruised around eBird quite a bit too. And you can see them. So Sitka Sedge is just north of Pacific City. It's a brand new, it's Oregon's newest state park, state recreation, state natural area. So It's so new that Google Earth just put the parking lot, like the satellite imagery on there. So now you can find it. But it's a beautiful spot with really great birding. Actually, I highly recommend it. Super cool. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.